and welcome to CGHE seminar stroke webinar number 279. We are inching towards the 300 mark, and we have a cast of 4 to explore with us today: graduate outcomes in UK transnational higher education, a case study of the United Arab Emirates. And I'll introduce our 4 speakers in a moment. Let me take you through the webinar protocols first. Remember that the webinar is being recorded and it'll be posted online on the CG website and through that YouTube and our YouTube channel within 48 hours or so. A transcript of the chat function will also be posted on our website. And during the webinar, please keep yourself muted unless you have been asked to speak. There's no need to have your video on either, but when you are brought into the Q&A, we advise you strongly to turn on your audio so we can hear what you're going to say, and it's a good idea also to turn on your camera so people can see you. We recommend using the speaker view command in the top right-hand corner there so you can more clearly see who is talking during the webinar. Now, to develop a question or to make a statement during the Q&A part of our webinar, important part of our webinar, use the chat function. Post your point or your question early in the chat function and you're likely to be selected into the discussion. I'll send you a warning in the chat before asking you to come into the Q&A. When you're invited in, please, as I said before, unmute yourself and turn on your video, and then state your name and where you are from. So let me introduce our 4 presenters. I think we're going to begin with Tristan McCowan, who's Professor of International Education at UCL's Institute of Education and one of the CG researchers on our Project 9, mapping supranational higher education space. He's also joined by Lee Rensimer, who's a research fellow at the UCL Institute of Education and working on that same Project 9, mapping supranational higher education space. And also Golo Henseke, who leads, in fact, Project 4 in the CG family of projects on graduate labour market and equity. And our 4th speaker is going to be Katariina Juusola, who's an assistant professor of marketing at Ajman University in the Emirates. So we look forward to hearing from all 4 speakers. And I think, Tristan, we're going to begin with you.
Thank you very much, Simon. And it's a great pleasure to be here with all of you and to talk about this research, which has been a really enjoyable collaboration with Lee, Golo and Katariina. And we will take you through some snippets of it here. This was actually a study that was commissioned by Universities UK International, who are interested in gathering a body of evidence about the outcomes of transnational higher education, UK universities operating in the transnational space. And happily, it coincided with different elements of our own interests. So the case study that we chose to do was of the UAE, and building on Lee's previous research and also Katariina's research there. We built on Golo's experience around survey and labour market graduate outcomes. And I'd done some work previously on employability. So it was a really nice collaboration for us to have. And obviously, transnational education is an area in which outcomes are particularly interesting because of a range of very complex and important questions about the equivalence of transnational education to the domestic provision of UK universities, as well as another comparison between transnational offerings in other parts of the world and the domestic provision there. Both of those complex and vital questions for researchers of higher education, but also, of course, for students and policymakers and so forth. Graduate outcomes of course, a very interesting and contested area, as is employability. The idea of graduate outcomes has come to the fore in policymaking and institutional practice through marketization. And one of the ways of attracting prospective students to one's institution, of course, is to show the returns in the labour market, but also from the perspective of states in accountability for public funding. So there's been a range of policy measures taken in relation to graduate outcomes, but many of these are seen to be highly problematic through reductive proxies of what those graduate outcomes might be. That's the first point. And secondly, because of problems of attribution as to whether the supposed outcomes that are attributed to universities are in fact university. And it could, of course, play both ways. Universities might get credit for things that they don't deserve, and they might get blamed for things which they have no responsibility. So it could go both ways. As you can see in this slide here, we've drawn on a very interesting paper by Tom Fryer, where he critiques some common uses of graduate outcomes in policy circles, and particularly the highly problematic identification of what he terms as graduate functionings with those range of graduate activities that can actually be attributed to the influence of the university. And this can be seen in measures such as employment after a certain period of time after graduating, salaries and so forth. And I think it's an obvious point to say that one's employment and salary may have something to do with one's university, but also a whole range of other things in one's life and previous experiences. And we have taken this caveat into our research. We don't use identical terminology to Fryer's paper. You'll hear that the term graduate outcome used in this presentation to describe a range of functionings, not necessarily in the only restricted to those that are directly caused by the university. But we bring the spirit of that critique into the research. So how are we conceptualizing graduate outcomes here? Well, the first point is that we're trying to avoid the reductive conceptualizations that see outcomes only in terms of whether somebody is employed or not, or their level of salary. Both of those things, of course, are very important, but they're not the only things we're interested in. And as we can see here on the left of the screen, we're also interested in well-being, international mobility. This is an important point, particularly relating to transnational education, which we'll expand on later. Identity and relationships. This was an area which we wanted to open up and actually yielded more than we were expecting. This ended up being quite an important part of our findings. And finally, about learning, the types of learning, quality of learning gained. Although it's important to emphasize this is not a student experience survey of the type that we're familiar with in the UK. And just a final point before we move in. One of the important aspects of the distinction between functionings and capabilities made by Amartya Sen and others, and also in this paper, is that when we think about graduate outcomes, we also need to be aware of what we might call the counterfactual. So what graduates are able to do, but they may not be doing at a particular point in time and at the time that they're being researched. It's very hard to actually gauge counterfactual through research, but we mustn't confuse functionings with capabilities. And that's another thing that we take through the rest of the research in terms of what we can and we can't show through the data that we've collected. Thanks, and I'll hand over now to.
So the study came about through Universities UK International, looking to begin to fill the void between two bodies of scholarship: graduate outcomes, transnational education. It's a curious gap in the literature, given how well established both of them are as fields of research, and fields of practice. Graduate outcomes research, as Tristan already said, it's in a very established field of multidisciplinary research, many different developed methodologies, some quite sophisticated, with baseline and end-line measures, some with annual snapshots. There's a number of different ways it can be done. And importantly, practiced by more than just academics and universities, also regulatory bodies, non-government, privately owned research organizations that might be interested in assessing returns on investment, or in some cases, student satisfaction, and any number of measures. And therefore, it's a field of practice that's also vital to policymakers and to universities who might want to know what taxpayer money is going to, for example, or how well universities are performing in their teaching. So there's that side of things. There's also then TNE, which as a form of global higher education is now thoroughly established over several decades and continually expanding. And of course, it's an increasingly important part of international trade, especially in the UK, in its export of educational services. For universities, it's a vital source of revenue. It's an opportunity for growth of research and for institutional learning. The scholarship in TNE, of course, has kept up with those aspects. But where it hasn't quite kept up with is the overlap between those two. And you can see in the Venn diagram on the right-hand side, there's a razor-thin overlap between these two fields, where, insofar as the sources that we could find, you could count them on one hand, the number of previous empirical studies that were done looking at graduate outcomes in transnational education. So I have to profess here that these three are focused on UK TNE, and that it may be the case, and I don't know myself whether other major exporters, particularly maybe ones in other languages, also have a comparably small amount of research on TNE, and I would think it's the case. So it does beg a curious question, though. Well, why is this? What's going on here? There are practical answers to that question. First of all, that TNE takes place in other jurisdictions with other involving other regulatory spaces and other regulatory bodies, and this requires national governments to get involved and perhaps also for universities delivering TNE, there's a degree of sensitivity in this. Some of them may participate in these kinds of exercises by requirement, but it might not be in their interest to have publicly shared the outcomes of these sorts of assessments, because it might reflect on their performance in some ways, especially in the UAE, where it is a highly commercialized market. These sorts of things can reflect on them and perhaps damage their reputation. So there's the practical side of things. There's also maybe a more theoretical or critical question that we could and perhaps should consider asking around, well, how are transnational students seen as different somehow? How are they out there and therefore out of sight and maybe not worthy of applying the same assessment that we apply to no small degree to the UK space, including international students in the UK. So there's that question I think would also be worth having debate around at some point. But we chose the UAE to examine in our study. It is a curious place as a concentrated TNE market, and in particular, the branch campus model of pretty much teaching only. Very little research takes place at these campuses, and they're all physically in-person taught spaces. So there are, depending on your definition, 33 international branch campuses in the UAE, spread across, well, three Emirates, Abu Dhabi, Dubai, and Ras Al Khaimah. And among them, the UK has a very strong presence. There are 9 established campuses that have been around for between 1 and 2 decades now, as well as 4 or 5 franchise degree programs that, well, for regulatory reasons, they still will call themselves branch campuses, but they more closely resemble franchises. If you look at just the Dubai market, which is the largest for both branch campuses and UK providers, 38% of all the IBC enrollments in Dubai are in UK providers. So the UK has a very pronounced or even outsized role in that market, especially with postgraduates, because a lot of the programs are MBAs. The UAE is also very curious as a space because it's has a devolved regulatory framework. So the rules that apply, the rules that are placed on providers are different, and so they attract different kinds of providers across the 3 Emirates that host branch campuses. And that also has knock-on effects for the graduates who might get a degree in a branch campus in Dubai and find themselves unable to work in the public sector in another emirate or go to a national university in that other emirate because of the disjointed nature of the framework. So in our study, we adopted a mixed methods approach, first capturing broadly, well, using a quantitative online questionnaire that, depending on the responses, 75 to 100 questions, took about 12, 15 minutes for participants to complete. We got 8 universities to help us distribute this questionnaire through their graduate cohort email lists, going 5 years back. So we decided to survey the previous 5 graduation cohorts. We got 202 responses out of that, and if you'll see down below that this was a non-probable sample representing what we think would be a little over 1% of the total possible graduate population, between I think 16 or 17,000 graduates in that 5-year range. We also did follow-up interviews with a diverse sample of graduates who participated in that questionnaire. So just to round some of the sharper edges of the data that we're collecting and getting some explanation around some of the responses. So the interviews were very helpful in that regard. Also, just to say that the study was collective, was a sector-wide approach, and we were interested in understanding broadly the range of possible TNE experiences graduates could have, not necessarily particular providers or linking certain outcomes we were seeing to particular providers. We're looking at the entire UAE as a space, and so we're hoping to capture as many possible TNE providers as we could. The survey instrument that we use, this questionnaire, asked questions that focused both on the functioning of graduates, what they're doing, and some things that might be considered causal relating to their higher education, their TNE choice. On the functioning side of things, we were interested in asking them about their job satisfaction, whether they were employed, and if they felt that they were using skills at a graduate level in their jobs. If they had chosen to study again, or were they planning to study again, and if so, where, what, and to what end. We're asking questions about their life satisfaction, their financial well-being, and also just general questions around their trust in others, their ability, at least how they felt they were able to communicate interculturally, and their perceived agency around international mobility, whether they not only chose to travel to other countries outside of their country of origin, but also whether they felt that they could as a result of their degree. So there's the second set of questions narrowed in on some of those drivers, including their prior socioeconomic background, maybe their family income, their family education level. Also their engagement with career support, which is ended up being quite an interesting and what we found to be a sizable effect on their earnings and their satisfaction. There's also questions that were looking at their skills and whether they felt that those skills specifically from their course correlated with their jobs. And then also questions around the counterfactuals, again, whether they thought they were potentially making more or less as a result of their degree. So all these things were there was no baseline measure. This is just their own reflections, their own self-assessments of their situations. There's no way to get around that and look at those measures directly. But given the situation, given what we had available to us, we thought that's actually still a robust approach to getting at outcomes, is to go directly to the students. So with that, I'm going to hand over to Golo to walk you through some of the findings.
Okay, thank you. So let me talk you through some of the percentages and other numbers that we've figured out. So the following is going to be a fairly descriptive account of some of the outcomes that we've measured and cause-effect relationships as reported by our study participants. A first question we had in approaching the study was basically who attended UK TNE providers in the United Arab Emirates. Our sample comprised mostly international and transnational mobile graduates. Almost all the respondents had some migration history. There were clear demographic segmentations by program level. Undergraduate level respondents, and that you can see in the chart in the slide, came from mostly expatriate backgrounds who moved to the UAE with their parents. By contrast, postgraduates were predominantly adult migrants or expats. What's not shown here is that this intersects as well with gender. Female respondents were more likely to report first degree level qualifications than males. Nonetheless, despite this demographic differences in program level and teaching mode, the majority of our respondents came from traditional higher education backgrounds whose parents had qualification from higher education and who were financially relatively secure growing up. In other words, only about a quarter in our sample was first and family. A similar proportion came from state schools, with the proviso here that private schools might not mean the same as in the UK context, as wages are usually, or as fees are usually a part of the wage component, often paid by an employer. Nonetheless, worthwhile highlighting. And finally, only 15% of the respondents recalled some sort of financial strain growing up. So we're all a fairly middle class sample. UK TNE provision in the UAE concentrates on professional fields, and this is reflected as well in our sample. In majority studied business management, followed by STEM. Okay, yeah, let's move on to some of the outcomes. So the first one is relates, on another question relates to the experience of TNE provision in retrospect. Need to. Overall, 84% of our respondents expressed high or very high levels of satisfaction with the teaching and learning aspects of their program. And that's comparable to levels reported, for example, by international students studying at UK institutions directly. There is no evidence that satisfaction differed systematically across demographics or by program attributes, suggesting that providers deliver a similar experience for all their students. We also asked our respondents how well the program contributed to their skills development, and 84%, and you can see that in this bar chart at the top, expressed agreement or strong agreement that their program equipped them with specialized knowledge. This was also highlighted in the interviews. Graduates mentioned gains in interpersonal skills, such as negotiating, consulting with people at different levels and with different specializations, or understanding the way people think, cognitive skills, i.e. critical thinking, analyzing problems, thinking outside the box, and as well as self-planning skills, planning, prioritizing, meeting deadlines, and so forth. Two things might have contributed to these gains. Again, this is something we found in the survey as well as in the interviews. First of all, a curricular mode of independent learning, which was often perceived as less academically challenging, but more rewarding as it enabled respondents to explore topics in depth and take responsibility for their own learning. There's teaching mode, or the way of delivery. And secondly, peers from diverse backgrounds. The value of the latter is, for example, highlighted by the brief quote in this slide. However, TNE graduates were also keen in pointing out that this intercultural experience that really added to really added to their TNE experience resulted from the international spaces within which these providers sat, rather than concerted efforts by the institutions themselves. All right, so this was a little bit on the experience. Let's move on to their labor market success. Nearly 80% of our sample respondents were in work, and of those, 9 in 10 in full-time. Just 5% were in further studies, and about 15% were not in employment, education, or training, which in some call need. So unemployment did not concentrate among recent graduates, but was spread across all years. In terms of quality of employment, 3 out of 5 were satisfied with their job. And about 70% were in jobs for which a degree was either a formal requirement or was useful in the application process. Similar percentage, 8 and 10, reported that they made use of most of their skills, knowledge, and competences in their work. And we looked at it as well in a different way by looking at the job tasks people carry out. And again, we found that about a quarter were in jobs that did not involve tasks that we would typically expect in a graduate job. So in other words, a fair share of those graduates, really a relatively large share of those graduates actually, was in graduate level employment. Given the close linkage of higher education with the job market in the UAE, in other words, we assessed the role, or that we found, we assessed the role of career development activities during TNE for these outcomes. In line with other private providers, UK TNE offers a range of career development activities, from support to work experience placements. And almost all of our respondents had engaged with at least one of these activities during their TNE studies. The figure in this slide illustrates the difference in outcomes between those who engage in career development activities and those who did not. Those who engaged were overall more optimistic about the program's impact across outcomes than those that did not. Nonetheless, in spite of an overall positive experience and decent level of graduate employment, only about half of the respondents felt that their career prospects improved as a result of their program, with undergraduates being considerably less optimistic. The interviews suggest that graduates felt that this was partly because other providers offered more effective career development opportunities, including internships with leading companies. Graduates repeatedly placed their work experience above degree qualification or formal teaching when asked about what contributed to their employability. And this is slightly less optimistic or a more pessimistic picture of the contribution of TNE graduate outcomes, employment outcomes specifically, is also corroborated by findings in our next slide. We asked, Lee already pointed out that because of the scope of the survey, we weren't in a position to collect actually earnings data. So we went around this and asked people, how do their earnings, how much do you earn compared to others of the same age with similar years of education and work experience? This is basically what a statistician would do and to calculate a wage premium. They would compare the wages of a particular type of graduate to others of similar characteristics and compare how much is that compared with the benchmark. We basically ask people to carry out this benchmarking activities themselves. In responses, said that only a minority actually reported a positive pay premium, almost 23%. Almost 4 in 10 reported worse earnings than colleagues of the same age with similar years of education, but without TNE. A rough estimate suggests that respondents' earnings were about 6% lower than the earnings of non-TNE graduates. But of course, as any wage premium, this might be misleading or misleading estimate of UK TNE contributions to earning. TNE graduates are predominantly foreigners, as we've seen, and might face less favorable treatment in the UAE labor market. So we therefore added another question that asked respondents to think about their life and career if they had not completed the UK degree program and instead pursued an alternative. So in your estimation, then we asked them to estimate how their earnings would have been if they had pursued this alternative instead. So it's basically asking people about the road not taken, what's at the end of the road not taken, compare that please with your earnings that you currently have. And this is one of these counterfactuals Tristan was talking about that are really, really difficult to actually measure. So usually statisticians or researchers can't really agree on what the counterfactual is. And we ask our respondents to make this very challenging job and give us basically an estimation how their world would look like if they had not done or attended TNE. So in this chart, TNE would have an impact on earnings if respondents felt that their earnings would have been lower in the world without TNE. In our sample, a quarter thought the TNE program helped to change their earnings for the better. 4 in 10 thought it did not make much difference, and nearly 1 in 5 estimated that alternative pathways would have led to higher earnings. Also, although more optimistic than the premium that just discussed earlier, the difference UK TNE has made over other pathways is on average near 0 if we take the responses at face value. In other words, UK TNE is not better or worse than other alternative pathways in terms of potential earnings according to our respondents. A slight caveat here, people struggled with these questions. They're really, really tough. 14% and 17% respectively said they don't know how much or less they earned or would have earned in a world without TNE. That's a limitation, and further research might be needed to validate these particular questions. Okay, but that's on the employment outcomes. Next, Katariina.
So our study also looked into international mobility of these graduates and what kind of influence their degree had on the graduates' identity and personal lives. So first, if we talk about the international mobility, of course, the TNE is about transnational mobility also. And we found out that about 15% of these graduates in our sample already lived in a third country being outside the UAE or UK. And about half of this sample would also consider working outside the UAE or UK in the next 5 years. So this was probably not surprising. We were expecting that they are most likely probably considering relocating because many of these sample students were already kind of mobile based on their background. And we also asked them a question whether they took this advantage of studying in UK during their studies, maybe spending 1 semester or a term or completing their studies in the UK. And actually we found out that it was a very small percentage of the students who were interested or who had done this kind of inter-campus transfer during their studies. It was less than 25% of the sample who did so. And most of these were then postgraduates. And then another aspect that we also surveyed these participants was about whether they had experienced any issues with their degree recognition in the UAE or overseas. We wanted to bring this question to our study because especially in the UAE, not necessarily all higher education institutions here are considered as equivalent when it comes to the degrees, unless they have the local Ministry of Higher Education accreditation on their programs. So many of these UK TNEs do not have the local accreditation in the UAE, which means that their degrees are not then recognized for further studies in those universities in the UAE that are locally accredited. So we found out that about 25% or 1 in 4 experienced these kinds of problems with degree recognition issues in the UAE or overseas. What they had then done was some of the participants had studied another degree that would be then considered valid for pursuing further studies in the UAE, or some had moved overseas to continue their studies. And then the last aspect that we touched on was about the influence of the degree on graduates' identity and personal lives. And these numbers were actually perhaps slightly higher than what we thought, because we have to take into consideration that this study focused on this time period in which the COVID-19 obviously has had a huge impact on graduates' employment and personal lives. Nevertheless, the life satisfaction score was 7.1 out of 10, which in comparison is slightly higher than the same in the UK. That was, I think, 6.9 on the same time period than when we collected our data. And the participants also reported that about 65% were doing well financially, and 54% expect to do even better the next year. So those were the last findings that we would like to discuss today. And to conclude, a couple of things to reflect on this research. So we conducted this research basically last summer. And this research was a little bit challenging in many different ways. The timing was quite tight. We only had a couple of months for the data collection, and we did spend considerable time contacting all these TNE providers in the UAE. And we also had this setback with the timing that the time when we contacted these institutions, there happened to be religious holidays and also other surveys being done at those institutions. So it was quite challenging to, first of all, get these institutions to collaborate with us. And also, these challenges then revealed that these are really two different operational contexts, the UAE and UK. And we were involved both with the home campus in the UK and their staff as well as those in the UAE, and tried to find ways to contact their graduates. And then about the methodological challenges, we also faced both practical and theoretical challenges, like Professor Tristan mentioned at the beginning. This whole concept of graduate outcomes is a very difficult subject to approach because the graduates no longer belong to their institutions, and especially in a TNE context, they might not even be in that country anymore. So tracing them, getting in touch with them was very difficult. And that posed some challenges. However, we were very satisfied with the results. We were quite pleased with the response rate that we received. So the survey provided us some good results, and we then combined the survey data with those in-depth interviews that we did in order to bring in a little bit more insights to the data. And of course, also the COVID-19 impact was something that perhaps limited our participant numbers a little bit. Some of these TNE providers even were a little bit hesitant to collaborate because they thought that maybe the findings will be a bit more negative to the COVID, that might put then the institution into a bad light, which is not, of course, something that they can take charge of. And also we were limited to this 5 years time period after graduation when selecting these participants. So we did have a somewhat limited sample. However, as mentioned, we were quite satisfied with the overall sample that we received and the results. And I think that's all. Lee, would you like to conclude?
Sure, I'll just wrap up by briefly acknowledging that University UK International supported the project from the beginning, but also played a very pivotal role in opening a lot of doors and sort of being the important intermediary with our university partners in the UAE. They had the networks and were very helpful in making that happen for us. But of course, also just to acknowledge the many participants, the universities themselves, and the heads of the regulatory agencies in Dubai, Ras Al Khaimah, and Abu Dhabi, who gave us some important contextual background prior to engaging in the research. So for anyone who's interested in further detail and following up on all the findings, you can find the report on the University UK International website. The link is here on this slide, or I think if you just Google the title of the report, it should come up. So with that, thank you for listening, and we welcome any questions you may have.
Golo and Tristan, very interesting study under difficult circumstances of the pandemic, but you have produced a lot of useful data. Interesting group, aren't they, the TNE users? They're mostly middle class, clearly many intending to be globally mobile, aspiring to, or at least open to working internationally, half of the group. That's very significant compared to a normal student graduate sample, and indicates that there is something, distinctive about this group that uses TNE, or at least large parts of them. There is whether it's or not it's TNE that explicitly makes them globally orientated in terms of employment outcomes. Certainly, there's a specific market here of people who aspire to work internationally and flexibly internationally, and treat their education in a similar way to their work in that respect. Got a couple of questions. We've also got a couple of questions coming through in the chat. My questions are, well, really three quick ones. One is the 1 to 5 year span. That's interesting. I mean, the problem with early graduate outcomes is always that you don't really know how conclusive that is. Firstly, the first year especially, though it depends a bit on the discipline. Did you notice, I know we're talking about small numbers here, but did you notice any real differences between the 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 year parts of the group? Second question I had was in relation to skills and knowledge. I mean, the talk about in terms of outcomes is about skill mostly, as is usually often the case with our discussion of graduate outcomes. But what role did the disciplinary knowledge play in shaping their futures and their sense of what they learned and so on? I realize that's a question of what kinds of, of interrogation you had through the survey and through the interviews. You may not have used knowledge as a category, but a lot of us who are actively working on graduate issues are interested in the relationship with knowledge specifically, not just skill. The other thing I wanted to ask you about was this interesting point made in the middle of the presentation about the international sort of awareness, intercultural and international awareness that came through also in the quote that was used, and how that was incidental to what the institution was doing, but it seemed to be something that came out of the student space, I guess. Or is it the student and academics together space? Can you expand a little bit on that? What was driving that kind of intercultural learning and intercultural awareness? So that's three things. 1 to 5 years, is there any variation across the time span? Secondly, did you find out about knowledge as opposed to skill? And thirdly, this question of, what was the nature of this intercultural learning?
First go at well, questions 1 and 3. So combining 5 years of data, five cohorts does lead to, an aggregated figure that may not represent the either end of things. Yeah, it is. I think we could say that there's quite a difference between those who had freshly graduated, especially those coming straight out and into the pandemic economic context, and those that had graduated previously and were, safely in their jobs. The difference between undergraduate and postgraduate is equally stark. As Golo pointed out, that there was a very pessimistic attitude from the undergraduates, and I think this is just the nature of those who had previous work experience or a career prior to doing a degree, and those who didn't. The postgraduates were an older cohort in general, and many of them had lots of working experience. So many of them might have, actually quite a few, I think a majority did do their degree part-time in order to keep their jobs, and so they didn't experience that transitional shock of leaving a job, doing a career, doing a degree, and then trying to relaunch a career. So I think both the different types of students, undergrad and postgrad, and then also different years, it produced considerably different results that might in some ways get lost in merging them all together. But then in the report, we do also try to tease that apart. Trying to recall your third question here. Sorry, you're muted, Simon.
It was about the international learning, but perhaps we better not let my questions take over this. We've now got a number of people coming in the chat.
Sorry.
Okay. So I think I'd rather at this point pass to them, colleagues, if that's all right, and leave my questions unanswered. Now, can we bring in what I think I'll do, given that you've left us only 10 minutes towards the end, what I'll do, I think, is bring in the 5 questions I have sitting there, and bring them in one after another, and then give you, the panel, the option of answering them, and that'll complete the webinar. So please communicate with each other to determine who will answer each question. So sort that out as we go, and so that way also we'll remember all the questions. So don't try and answer them all yourself, Lee. I think just pass them around a bit, and it will work that way. Now, our first question then is the redoubtable Glenn Chatelia. If they awarded gold medals for coming in first with the question in CG webinars, Glenn would be in the Michael Phelps category. He does this every webinar really well. He comes out with a good question right at the beginning. So Glenn, let's have it.
Thank you, Simon. I'll take the gold medal later, but let me ask my question now, okay? Thanks for that presentation. It was very, very, edifying. I learned a lot. Given the regulations, specified by the United Arab Emirates Board of Governance in Education, and given the interests of the universities entering to offer the TNE type of education, to what level did your study measure cases of upskilling, reskilling, or equipping the switch in careers, given that most of the respondents were in the business STEM education programs? Thank you.
Okay, hold that question. Now, our next question is from Namala Elmin Simbolan. So Namala, are you there?
Yes, please. Yeah, thank you, Simon. It is very interesting topic, yeah, and it is my interest of research actually. So my question is with the number of the graduates in two areas. The first one with the 15% of graduates in the third country, what are they doing? I mean, like their jobs, because it is, to my understanding, it will it can be related to like the perceived benefits of TNA in some countries. And I'm also still wondering if there are some graduates living in the UK, even though like in your presentation mentioning that actually 50% likely to apply, but I'm wondering if some of them choose to stay in there because there are some factors why they don't choose to stay in the UK. Thank you, Simon.
And thank you, Namala. Hold that thought again. And Duncan is next. Duncan Lampard, can you come in, please?
Yes. Hi. I hope you can hear me.
We can hear you. Yep.
A very straightforward question, which I guess all four of the contributors could have their own point of view on this. But I just wondered, given that clearly there's some experience amongst the team of the UAE and transnational education, I'm just wondering which of the findings or which part of the process came as the most, what surprised them from the exercise, either pleasantly or not so pleasantly. Yeah, that was it.
Oh, thanks, Duncan. Now, the next question is from Miguel Lim, but Miguel's in a cafe with bad sound, so he's asked me to read his question, and it's got two parts. First one is about methodology. Now, for employment, did you pattern your survey on existing instruments like the UK DLHE? And more generally, this is the second question, I think, you mentioned that you also studied well-being and attitudinal aspects, apart from employment and mobility. Could you comment more on your findings in that area? So that's two parts, about the survey instrument and then about the attitudinal aspects, such as well-being. And our final question in this group of five is from Anand Chen. So Anand, can you come in, please?
Yeah, hi, thank you. Thank you so much for the presentation. It's very helpful for my own research, which is also about international education and graduate outcome. So it's just a very quick question about your qualitative stage of your research, because you haven't talked a lot about this. I'm just wondering, like, did you use the interview stage to like probe into the survey responses of those graduates, or you use this stage to like figure out the causal relationship of transnational education and graduate outcome? Or like how exactly did you like come to the causal relationship of those two parts? Thank you.
Okay. Colleagues, over to you as to how you respond to all five, and who would like to take the first stab at that? Do I see a hand up? Who's going to answer the question?
I can just make a very quick comment in relation to what surprised us most, but this also links in with your earlier question, Simon, which was about the intercultural side. And I think
yes,
there were some things that surprised us, but one thing that perhaps wasn't a surprise, but certainly pleasant, it was pleasant to see and pleasantly surprised, was the emphasis on the intercultural awareness, because I think we weren't sure if this was going to come up, and I think it was a really interesting aspect of the findings. And just linking in with what you're asking before, I think you know, we of course we haven't drilled down so deeply to really be able to understand this, but this comes from the space rather than any deliberate formal aspect of the curriculum. And I think it's a really important aspect of universities that perhaps we don't research enough, but this you know, the community aspect of it. And I think in the context of UAE, where I understand, and colleagues will probably be able to comment further, the school experience is rather more siloed. This higher education, in this sense, functions as a space in which people can come together across difference. And I think that's not only true of the TNE providers, but perhaps also of other universities. But certainly in societies in which there aren't always shared spaces, it's a critical aspect of what higher education is.
yeah, yeah.
I can quickly comment on the questioner, Miguel's questions. First, yes, we've used existing instruments or borrowed from existing instruments, such as the graduate destination survey. There's more on well-being, and that there's more on well-being in the report. So please feel free to download it. And relating to, again, back to the survey, just one thought. In fact, the survey is going to be used by others again. JISC currently is developing an assessment of TNE provision globally, our UK TNE provision, and is using our survey as well, questionnaire as the baseline for their efforts to develop an instrument. And most surprising for me was the issues around degree certification, which I have never really thought about in more detail. But it's really actually, yeah, that's something that I found interesting.
Okay, well, we've covered some of the questions, I think, Anand's question and Miguel's question. We covered Duncan, and we covered Namala, Glenn. Anything further you would like to say, panel? Yes, Lee.
Sorry, I'll just come in on, some things that Tristan was speaking to around intercultural communication, I think also dovetails nicely with Anand's question around the qualitative component of the research. Yeah. We weren't really expecting to find that. You know, there was a question or two around whether they could, you know, more comfortably communicate with other international students, given the UAE is a very hybrid space. But it's the interviews that really built that out, and really where they volunteered information that there wasn't a structured question already for. So it just enabled us to go in new directions that we weren't looking previously. But for the most part, we use those interviews to also explore some of the things that we really didn't understand, like the degree recognition question. What's going on there? Why did 25% of our respondents have an issue with degree recognition? So we could ask them, well, what happened? And what were the effects of that? And so it just really allowed us to build out a deeper understanding. So that was pretty effective. If there's time, I'll just quickly address Normala's question. And in fact, this was a surprising thing. Thinking we thought there'd be more sort of international mobility in and out of the UAE among the cohort, the cohorts that we're looking at, when actually there wasn't that much. Those that had gone to a third country were going elsewhere in the Gulf, or you know, it's not like they were well. Let's for lack of a better term, you say moving up in the international mobility sense. They weren't like migrating to North America or Europe or something like that. They were actually sticking either close to the UAE. Very few ended up in the UK, and those who did, I think, already had some pre-existing relationship with the UK.
Okay, I think we've picked up Duncan's question. Did someone say something there?
If I may add.
Please do.
Also to address Normala's question, what do those 15% of the graduates do who ended up in a third country? Quite many of them actually had then pursued further studies. So some of them had moved to the US or UK, Australia, and were pursuing then further education. And we did ask them like generic questions like, if they're employed, do they have the kind of job that matches their education? But we didn't really go into too much detail exactly what do they do and who employs them. And then for me, the most surprising aspects about these findings were probably the degree recognition issue, like Lee already mentioned. I knew that this might be an issue, but I didn't expect that so many students have had these kinds of problems. And then on the positive side, I think the impact of COVID was not as bad as I had expected. We were worried actually a little bit before doing this study, because we knew that quite many of our participants were fresh graduates. So they had graduated during the COVID, which then might have had a negative impact on their employment. But overall, I think the results were more positive than what we had expected. And also the student experience during the COVID was better than maybe expected. They said that the universities had provided them very good online learning environment and even some collaboration between the home campus. So overall, it didn't seem to have such a bad experience on the students and what they are thinking about their degrees and the time that they spent studying.
Well, thanks, Katariina, and thanks to everyone. I thought that was really good webinar, and you know, there's obviously a lot more that we could talk about in relation to these findings, and I think you'll help others to do something similar. It's not surprising that degree recognition is an issue, though, is it, with this kind of group? Because there's half of them are aspiring to work broadly across the world. They're going to run into obstacles in doing that and trying to transfer their qualifications into different jurisdictions. I mean, people are graduating domestically. They know the pathways they're on. Their degree recognition issues are minimal by comparison with a TNE group like this, who are intending to be globally, at least half of whom are intending to be globally mobile. But I was really struck by Tristan's point, actually, that, you know, that what higher education is a shared space where difference is encountered. I mean, I'm increasingly persuaded that we learn through difference, through our encounter with the other, which helps us to think differently about what we already know. And we encounter the other in higher education through other students as much as in any other way, you know, through their perspectives, their different life trajectories, their different belief systems, their different languages and ways of seeing. And by entering into a positive relationship with them, we start to see things through their eyes. And higher education plays this magnificent role of providing this large shared space where those kinds of encounters are routinized and normalized and encouraged. And no other part of society quite does this, especially in a learning framework. So, You know, TNE then, you know, for all its kind of prosaic character, its instrumental list of courses and so on, it's providing that in spades. You know, it's offering people a chance to encounter each other in a positive environment, and that's an encounter within a varied set of differences. So great to have you on the webinar program. Do come back, all 4 of you, again. Most welcome. Our next webinar is going to be another book webinar, a book launch webinar. We're launching the book, Changing Higher Education in East Asia, and the presenters will be, apart from Shinshu and myself, also Olga Mun and Yung Min from Korea. So look forward to seeing you all on Thursday for that webinar. And thank you again, panel, for your great contribution. And to everyone, bye for now.